He stayed with his father when all his brothers and sisters left. Instead of water, they dug up a jar of gold coins from the ground. But the gold not only brought life back to the farm, it also awakened the greed of those who had abandoned their family. Look what the discovery led to. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The land had grown weary of giving. For months, the sky had withheld its mercy, and the soil cracked open in jagged lines that spread like scars across the fields. Once, the farm had been a place of abundance, where corn rose tall and golden under the sun, and the wheat bent in thick, rolling waves with the wind. Now the stalks stood brittle and lifeless, their husks rattling like dry bones whenever the hot breeze swept across the valley. The earth had hardened into a crust that no plow could break easily, and when the old farmer pressed his boot into the ground, it left no impression. It was as if the soil itself had grown indifferent, refusing to remember the years of sweat and devotion poured into it. The house sagged against the weight of time, its wooden boards warped from decades of weather and neglect. Once white, the paint had peeled away, leaving streaks of gray and brown, and the porch creaked beneath every step. The barn stood nearby like a hollow shell, its doors hanging loose, revealing empty stalls where cattle used to shift and low at dawn. The troughs were dry, the well nearly empty, and the pond where ducks had once splashed was now little more than a mud pit, its edges ringed with cracked clay. Silence reigned, broken only by the moan of wind against the fence posts and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead in search of prey. Inside the house, the old man sat by the window, his body hunched and lean from years of toil. His skin was leathered from the sun, his hands calloused from tools that had long since worn smooth in his grasp. Deep lines cut across his face, each a memory etched by hardship, each a reminder of seasons of both triumph and loss. Yet his eyes, shadowed beneath heavy brows, still carried a fire that drought had not managed to extinguish. He stared out across the withering fields with a look that was equal parts grief and defiance, as if daring the land to break him. He had once believed that his farm would be a legacy, a place where his children would gather, where their laughter would mingle with the rustle of crops, and where their own children would learn the value of soil and sweat. But that dream had withered as surely as the fields beyond his window. One by one, his children had left. The eldest son had gone to the city, trading the dust of the fields for polished shoes and office walls. He sent letters at first, filled with talk of opportunity, of money earned without calloused hands, but those letters had grown fewer until they stopped entirely. A daughter had married a merchant and moved away, speaking of the farm as though it were a burden best forgotten. Another son had joined the army, drifting further from home with every deployment, and another had chosen business over the plow, convinced that there was no future in land that yielded less with every passing year. They had all left, chasing lives that did not include the farm or the father who had poured himself into it. And the old man, though he tried not to let bitterness harden his heart, carried a weight heavier than any harvest he had ever lifted. He had given them everything, his strength, his guidance, his years, and in return he had been left behind, tethered to a dying patch of earth that no one else wanted. Only one had remained. His youngest son, not yet hardened by years, but tempered by loyalty, still worked beside him. The boy was in his 20s, tall and wiry, his muscles built from toil rather than training. His hands bore the same marks of labor as his father's, though his skin was younger, his eyes brighter. He had not been seduced by the city's glow, nor swayed by promises of easier wealth. Instead, he had chosen to stay, to share in the hardship, to bind his future to the fate of the land that had nearly consumed his father. Together, they bore the weight of survival. Morning to night they labored, mending fences, tending the few animals that remained, and turning soil that no longer wanted to yield. They shared meals that were plain and sparse, bread hardened by age, and beans that had been stretched thin. At night, when the cicadas sang in the heat and the air hung heavy with dust, they sat on the porch in silence, the old man with his thoughts of what had been, the son with his quiet resolve for what might yet come. It was during one of those evenings that the idea of drilling for water took root. The old man had sat long in silence, staring out at the horizon, where the sun dipped low and bled red across the fields. He had thought of wells gone dry, of parched roots beneath the soil, of the faint hope that somewhere beneath their feet lay salvation. His voice, when it came, was rough, as if unused to speaking such hope aloud. They would try. They would dig until they found water, or until the land swallowed their last strength. For without water, there would be no farm, no future, nothing but dust and memory. The young man agreed without hesitation. There was no hesitation in him at all, no pause to weigh the futility of the task. He had inherited his father's stubbornness, but also his mother's quiet grace, and he bore both like armor against despair. To him, the work was not a punishment, but a duty, an act of faith in the soil that had raised them. And so, with tools worn by years of use, they began. The days grew longer as they labored. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning their sweat to salt on their skin. The earth was hard and unyielding, and each strike of the auger sent vibrations up their arms, rattling bones and nerves. Dust clung to their clothes, their mouths filled with the taste of grit, and their muscles ached as if the land itself resisted their efforts. Yet they did not stop. Father and son, bent beneath the heat, pressed on. Each turn of the auger was a prayer, each shovelful of dirt a plea for mercy from the silent earth. At night, the old man would collapse into his chair, his body trembling from exhaustion, but his mind still burning with determination. He thought of the other children who had turned their backs on him, who would never understand this bond between a man and his land, between a father and the son who refused to leave. He thought of the years he had spent carving life from soil, the sacrifices made, the seasons survived. And though the weight of abandonment pressed hard against him, he found comfort in the presence of the one who remained. The young man worked with a vigor that reminded the old man of himself in younger days. He did not complain, did not falter, though the task seemed endless. When blisters broke open on his palms, he wrapped them in cloth and pressed on. When heat shimmered across the fields, he poured water over his head and kept digging. His resolve became the old man's strength, a silent assurance that the fight was not yet lost. Day after day, the hole grew deeper. The dirt piled high, forming mounds around the pit like small burial hills. The old man sometimes wondered if they were digging their own grave, but he pushed the thought aside, unwilling to yield to despair. He focused instead on the rhythm of labor, the steady turn of the auger, the scrape of metal against stone. And somewhere deep within, he clung to the belief that the earth, though hardened, still held secrets waiting to be revealed. The drought had taken much, but it had not taken hope entirely. Beneath the surface, unseen and unheard, something waited. The old man did not know what it was, but he felt it, as if the land itself whispered that their toil would not be in vain. And as the sun sank low one evening, painting the fields in shadows and fire, he allowed himself the smallest of smiles. For though the farm seemed on the edge of death, he and his son were still fighting, and as long as they fought, the farm still lived. The days that followed blurred into one another, an endless cycle of heat and dust, sweat and strain. The old man's back ached, his knees throbbed, his hands split open at the knuckles. Yet each morning, he rose and returned to the hole. His son was always there before him, already working, the sound of the auger rising like a heartbeat in the silence of dawn. Together they carried on, their bond forged in hardship, their hope buried deep in the soil they sought to conquer. And though the earth gave nothing at first, though the drought showed no mercy, the old man began to sense that something waited below, hidden in the silence, waiting to be found. It would not be water that answered them first, but something else entirely, something long forgotten by the world above. The days of digging stretched into a weary rhythm, and though exhaustion threatened to bow their backs, father and son carried on. The hole grew deeper with each sunrise, a dark scar carved into the unyielding earth, and the piles of dirt surrounding it rose like miniature hills that told the story of their persistence. The air remained dry and merciless, the sun pouring its heat upon them without restraint, yet within that steady cadence of labor, there was a fragile thread of hope that held them together. The old man, though his joints ached and his body trembled at night, found strength in the presence of his son, who rose with him each morning, already moving the auger into place, already ready to strike the ground again. There were moments when the old man wondered if their work was folly, if the land had nothing more to give, but he silenced those doubts by focusing on the simple act of turning soil. It was this silence, heavy and determined, that carried them from one day to the next, until at last the silence was broken by an unexpected sound. It came suddenly, almost too faint to believe. The auger bit into something solid with a metallic clang, a sharp note that did not belong to stone or root. The young man froze mid-turn, his eyes darting to his father, who had paused in the act of brushing dust from his brow. For a heartbeat, they stood still, listening to the echoes reverberate within the hole. The sound was foreign, alien in this place, where they had expected only more layers of lifeless soil. With cautious movements, the son turned the auger again, and once more the metallic ring shivered up the shaft of the tool, undeniable and distinct. The old man's heart quickened, though he forced his face to remain impassive. He had learned long ago that hope was dangerous, that it could lift a man only to dash him harder against the ground. Yet there was no mistaking it. Something buried in the earth was waiting for them. Together they began to scrape away at the dirt, their shovels biting into the hardened clay, loosening it chunk by chunk. The soil resisted at first, but as they cleared it, a dark, corroded edge emerged, glinting dully in the half-light. The son dug faster, his breath quickening with anticipation, while the father watched with a mixture of unease and awe. Soon, the shape became clearer, a rusted tin, small and cylindrical, its once bright surface mottled with decay. It was an ordinary object in form, yet out of place in the deep earth, as though it had been hidden with intention. The young man knelt in the dirt, brushing away soil with trembling fingers until the container was free enough to lift. It was heavier than it looked, and when he set it on the ground beside them, the sound of shifting contents whispered of secrets kept too long. The old man stared at it, his breath shallow. He recognized it at once for what it was. A coffee can, the kind sold decades ago, common in kitchens across the country. But no family had buried such a thing so deep without reason. With careful hands, the son tried to pry open the lid, but the metal clung stubbornly, fused with time and corrosion. At last, with a twist and a groan of strained metal, the lid gave way, releasing a faint musty odor, the scent of decades sealed in darkness. And then they saw it. Coins, their surfaces dulled by age, but unmistakable in their gleam, filled the tin. Golden discs, their edges worn smooth by time, glimmered beneath the fading light. For a moment, both father and son simply stared, the sight almost unreal, as though the sun itself had been captured and hidden away in the earth. The young man let out a breath that was half laughter, half disbelief, his eyes wide as his hands hovered above the treasure. The old man, however, felt no laughter rising within him. Instead, his chest tightened with a weight he could not name. Mixed among the coins were fragments of old newspaper, crumbling at the edges, their ink faded, but still faintly legible. Headlines spoke of collapse and despair. Banks closing their doors, families losing everything, crops rotting in fields for lack of buyers. Between the brittle sheets, tucked carefully as though to preserve it, was a scrap of paper bearing a few faded words, written in hurried hand. For the dark days. The letters had blurred, the ink bleeding into the fibers, but the meaning was clear enough. Whoever had placed this can in the earth had done so not out of greed, but out of fear, clinging to it as a lifeline in desperate times. The young man's fingers brushed against the coins, lifting one into the light. The golden surface, though tarnished, caught the sun and flared brightly. His eyes shone with excitement, and though he tried to temper his expression, his heart could not hide its joy. To him, this was deliverance, a miracle unearthed at the very moment they needed it most. He imagined the possibilities with youthful clarity. Tools, animals, seed, repairs. A future that had seemed bleak just hours before now seemed to shimmer before his eyes. The old man did not share in the smile. His gaze remained on the can, on the brittle papers, on the history entombed within the earth. He thought of the Great Depression, though he had been only a boy when its shadow stretched across the land. He remembered the stories, the neighbors who had buried jars in gardens, coffee tins beneath floorboards, desperate to keep what little they had, safe from failing banks. This can, unearthed after so many decades, was more than gold. It was a testament to fear, to hardship, to the lengths people had gone to protect themselves. To see it now in his field felt like both a gift and a warning. The young man looked to his father, waiting for words, for some sign of what they would do. But the old man was silent. Within him, conflicting emotions stirred. Gratitude, that the earth had offered them something in their time of need. Pride, that his son was here to witness it, to share in the discovery. Yet also dread, for he knew that such wealth was never free of burden. Gold could save, but it could also destroy, and he feared that this can, rather than being salvation, might yet tear apart what remained of his family. At last, he lifted his gaze to the horizon. The sun was sinking, its red light spilling across the dry fields, painting the land in colors of fire and blood. He thought of the children who had left, who had chosen other lives, who had turned their backs on the farm. If they were to learn of this treasure, would they return? And if they did, would it be to help or only to take? He feared he already knew the answer. The sun, still glowing with excitement, suggested they carry the can into the house, to count its contents in the light of the lantern. His voice was filled with energy, his body nearly trembling with eagerness. The old man nodded slowly, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He watched as his son lifted the can, muscles straining against its weight, and for a fleeting moment, he saw not a man, but the boy he had once been. Eager and innocent, unaware of how heavy the world could be. They walked back together across the yard, the rusted can held between them. The air was cooler now, the shadows stretching long, but the old man felt a heaviness that no evening breeze could lift. He could not shake the thought that the earth, in giving up this secret, had also given them a trial. Whether it would bind him and his son more closely or invite ruin into their lives remained hidden, like the coins had been, waiting to be revealed. That night, after the can was placed on the wooden table inside the dimly lit kitchen, the son fell into restless dreams, his mind alive with visions of green fields and flowing water. But the old man sat long into the night, staring at the tin, the flickering lantern casting shadows across the walls. He thought of promises made long ago, of children lost to distance and ambition, of the one who had stayed. The coins glowed faintly in the light, their surfaces reflecting not just wealth, but questions too heavy to ignore. When at last he rose to his bed, his steps were slow. He knew that their lives had changed with that metallic ring in the earth, that nothing would ever be the same again. Whether it was fortune or curse, he could not yet decide. But deep within him, beneath the weight of doubt, a quiet certainty grew. This discovery was no accident. It was, in its way, a judgment, a reckoning for loyalty and for abandonment alike. And though the dawn would bring new choices, for now, the night held only silence and the promise of challenges yet unseen. Morning broke with a quiet haze over the valley, the kind of dawn that brought no relief from the heat, but softened the edges of the land for a brief, merciful hour. Inside the farmhouse, the tin sat heavy upon the kitchen table, its lid open, its contents still gleaming faintly in the early light. The young man rose before his father, his mind restless with possibilities, unable to push aside the image of those coins and what they might mean. For him, they were not just relics, but tools, fuel for a future he had only dared to imagine. He stepped outside, feeling the dust rise beneath his boots, and looked across the barren fields with a new sense of ownership. It was no longer a place condemned to die beneath drought. It was land that could be reborn. The old man followed slowly, his frame stiff with the wear of decades, his expression more guarded. He had not slept well. While his son's dreams were filled with images of abundance, his own had been haunted by memories of past betrayals, of neighbors who had fallen into ruin when wealth brought division, of families torn apart by greed. He looked at the fields, not with the impatience of youth, but with the caution of someone who understood the delicate balance between gift and curse. And yet, as his gaze drifted over the cracked soil, he felt a stirring deep within a conviction that perhaps the earth had granted them one last chance to honor the life he had built. The decision was unspoken, but shared between them. The coins would not be hoarded, nor spent on comforts that meant nothing to the land. They would be used as lifeblood, poured back into the veins of the farm itself. By midday they had ridden into town, the tin hidden beneath a worn cloth in the bed of their old truck. The trip was long and dusty, the road lined with fields much like their own, where other farmers had given up and left their land to weeds. The sight filled the father with unease, but it hardened his resolve. He would not allow his farm to become another abandoned relic. In town, the young man's excitement carried them through the marketplace and into the supply stores. They purchased a pump strong enough to draw water from deeper than their well had ever reached, new piping to stretch across the fields, and sacks of seed chosen with care. Tools were added to the pile, heavy shovels and gleaming wrenches, the kinds of things that could withstand seasons of use. The old man watched every coin counted out, his jaw tight, his eyes always wary of the curious glances cast their way. He knew that wealth, even when spent modestly, had a scent, and people could smell it. Still, he let his son handle most of the transactions, knowing that the boy needed to feel the weight of responsibility. When they returned home, the work began at once. The pump was installed near the edge of the well, its metal frame stark and new against the weathered boards of the farm. The old man guided the process, his hand steady despite their tremor, his knowledge etched from years of improvising with little more than scrap and persistence. The young man worked tirelessly, his back bent beneath the sun, his shirt dark with sweat, his arms corded with effort. The first time the pump rumbled to life, coughing and shuddering, they both stood in silence, waiting. Then, with a sputter and a roar, water burst forth, muddy at first, then clearer, spilling into the trough with a vigor neither had seen in months. The old man closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of rushing water fill him. It was more than noise. It was the voice of the land itself, speaking again after too long a silence. The young man laughed aloud, unable to contain his joy, splashing his hands beneath the stream as if he were a child again. The father allowed himself a smile, rare and fleeting, but genuine. He felt as though the farm itself had exhaled, as though the ground was sighing in relief. Days turned into weeks, and the transformation unfolded slowly but surely. The water coursed through the new pipes, soaking fields that had once lain cracked and barren. Shoots of green began to pierce the soil, tentative at first, then bolder, until entire rows of crops whispered with the promise of life. The barn, too, began to fill again. Chickens scratched in the yard, their feathers ruffling in the dust, while a pair of calves kicked their heels in the corral, their cries echoing across the farmstead. The once silent air grew thick with sound, the murmur of leaves, the splash of water, the cluck and call of animals. Neighbors began to notice. Men driving past on the road slowed their trucks to look, their faces shadowed with both admiration and envy. Some stopped to ask questions, their voices light, but their eyes sharp. How had they managed it? Where had they found the means to turn dry soil into a patch of green? The young man spoke openly of their labor, his words colored by pride, while the old man stood back, silent, watching the reactions carefully. He saw the nods of respect, but he also saw the tightness in jaws, the lingering glances at their equipment, the curiosity that bordered on suspicion. He knew that news traveled quickly in places where nothing ever changed. Despite the whispers, the father and son carried on. Their bond deepened with each passing day, strengthened not by words, but by the rhythm of their work. They rose together before dawn, shared meals in the heat of noon, and labored side by side until the stars emerged above them. At night, when the younger man collapsed into bed with the exhaustion of honest toil, the father lingered on the porch, watching the field sway faintly in the breeze. He felt pride welling within him, not for the gold itself, but for what it had allowed them to do. He was proud of his son, who had chosen to stay, who had given life back not only to the farm, but to the old man's weary spirit. Yet beneath that pride, unease continued to gnaw at him. The coins had not been theirs to begin with. They had been hidden away by hands long turned to dust, meant as a safeguard against a world that had betrayed its people. By unearthing them, had he and his son invited a different kind of ruin? At times, when he closed his eyes, he imagined the shadows of his other children returning, their faces hard, their voices demanding. He pictured them not as the innocent boys and girls he had once carried in his arms, but as strangers with hearts sharpened by greed. The young man did not dwell on such thoughts. His focus was fixed on what was before him, the sprouts pushing through soil, the animals gaining weight, the barn filling with sounds of life. His laughter grew more frequent, his shoulders broader, his presence more assured. To him, the coins were no longer hidden wealth, but the seed from which they had drawn renewal. He looked at his father with admiration, grateful for his wisdom, determined to prove that their shared labor had been worth every drop of sweat. The old man, though quieter, shared in that gratitude in his own way. He spoke little of the future, but he began to plan in silence. He thought of wills and legacies, of what should be written down and what should be left unsaid. He considered how best to secure the farm, to ensure it would not fall prey to disputes when he was gone. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that such disputes were inevitable, yet he resolved that loyalty would be honored above all else. The son who had stayed, who had dug into the earth beside him, who had borne the burden of drought and despair without flinching, that son was the one who would inherit not just the land, but the spirit of the farm itself. And so the farm revived. The seasons turned, and where once there had been dust, there was now green. Where silence had hung, there was now the sound of water, of life returning to its rightful place. The house still leaned, the barn still bore the scars of neglect, but they no longer seemed like ruins. They were symbols of endurance, testaments to what could survive even when all seemed lost. Father and son stood within that revival, their bond strengthened, their hearts lighter, though shadows still lingered at the edges of their thoughts. For the old man knew that the earth never gave freely. It demanded payment in time, in toil, and often in sacrifice. The coins had brought them renewal, but he feared they had also awakened forces that would soon come knocking. And in quiet moments, as he listened to the wind sweep across the reborn fields, he braced himself for the day when those who had once abandoned him might return, not in love, but in hunger, for what they believed was theirs. The fields were no longer silent. Rows of green swayed gently in the warm wind, their leaves brushing together in whispers that carried the promise of harvest. Water ran steadily through the channels they had dug, shimmering in the sunlight like a lifeline restored. The barn rang with the sounds of life, the bleating of calves, the flutter of hens, the rhythmic thud of hooves on packed dirt. The farm had been reborn, not into grandeur, but into quiet abundance, and each morning as the old man stepped onto the porch, he felt a measure of peace that had long eluded him. He had thought the land was finished, that it would dry and die with him, but against the odds it had revived. Yet as he leaned on the rail and watched his son walk the rows with steady steps, he knew that peace was fragile. Life had returned to the soil, but so too would attention, and attention was rarely free of consequence. The first sign came as a truck rolled slowly down the dirt road, one late afternoon. Its paint gleamed too brightly for country roads, and its tires threw dust into the air as it stopped by the gate. From the cab stepped his eldest son, the one who had long ago traded boots for polished shoes. He wore a suit that did not fit the place, his shoes coated instantly with dust, his eyes hidden behind tinted glasses. He greeted his father with a smile that seemed rehearsed, his voice too warm, as though he were trying to melt years of absence with charm. He spoke of missing the farm, of longing to see it again, of how proud he was to witness its revival. The old man said little, his eyes sharp, his mind remembering how easily this son had walked away when the land had grown hard. Not long after, another car arrived, this one carrying the daughter who had married well and moved to town. She stepped out in a dress too fine for the dirt path, her hair carefully arranged, her fingers adorned with rings that caught the sun. She carried herself as though she were a visitor to a quaint memory, her eyes sweeping the farm with detached curiosity. She exclaimed at the crops, at the water flowing, at the animals, her voice high with amazement. Yet beneath her admiration lingered something else, a question unspoken but plain in her gaze. How had they managed this when everyone else had failed? In the days that followed, the others came too. The son, who had worn a soldier's uniform, returned with a stance still rigid from years away, his words measured, his tone respectful, but distant. The one who had turned to business arrived with the sharpness of a man used to bargaining, his eyes assessing everything, calculating value in each corner of the farm. They came not all at once, but soon enough the farmhouse was surrounded by faces that had once filled it with laughter, now older, harder, drawn back not by loyalty but by curiosity and suspicion. The young man, who had never left, greeted them with guarded politeness. He offered them water from the pump, showed them the rows of crops, let them marvel at the transformation. His heart wasn't filled with resentment, but neither did it swell with joy. He had carried the weight of the farm when they had not, and though he did not speak it aloud, his silence was its own kind of judgment. The old man watched it all unfold, his chest heavy with conflicting feelings. To see his children gathered again beneath the same roof should have been a blessing, yet instead it felt like the tightening of a noose. Their voices grew louder each day, their questions sharper. They spoke of miracles, of sudden fortune, of fairness. They looked at the new equipment, the healthy animals, the greening fields, and their words turned inevitably toward money. They did not speak of the coins directly, for they had not yet seen them, but the insinuation hung in the air like smoke. How else could this revival have come about? What else could explain the change? One evening, as the family sat around the table, the tension that had been simmering rose to the surface. The eldest son, his voice smooth, spoke of unity, of how the farm belonged to all of them. He said it would only be fair if its success was shared. The daughter, with her jeweled fingers resting delicately on the table, agreed, saying that family should never be divided by fortune. The soldier said little but nodded, while the businessman leaned forward, his eyes sharp as knives, asking pointed questions about where the funds had come from and how much remained. The old man listened in silence, his hands folded on the table, his face unreadable. Inside him, anger warred with sorrow. He remembered each of them as children, running through the fields, chasing chickens in the yard, their laughter ringing through the summer air. He remembered teaching them how to plant seeds, how to mend fences, how to respect the land. And he remembered, too, how one by one they had turned away, leaving him and their youngest brother to bear the burden alone. Now they returned, not to help, not to give, but to take. The young man sat quietly at the end of the table, his eyes fixed on his plate. He did not argue, did not raise his voice. His silence was steady, unshakable, the silence of someone who had already proven himself in sweat and labor. The old man looked at him and saw the truth laid bare. Loyalty was not spoken, it was lived, and his youngest son had lived it every day since the drought began. When the meal ended and the others retired to their rooms, the old man remained at the table, staring into the lantern's flickering light. His decision had already taken root in his heart, but now it hardened into certainty. The gold had not been given to divide them further, but to reveal the truth of their hearts. It had done its work well. He rose slowly and walked to his room, where in the quiet of the night he took out papers that had long lain untouched. With a trembling hand, but a clear mind, he began to write, setting down in ink what he had already resolved in spirit. The farm, the land, the legacy would pass not to those who had returned only when fortune smiled, but to the one who had remained when all hope was gone. Days stretched into weeks, and the visits of his other children grew more frequent, their tones less patient. Some tried persuasion, others pressed more directly, hinting at legal rights and family claims. The old man endured it all in silence, never revealing the tin, never explaining the coins. Instead, he watched them, listening to their words, seeing the hunger in their eyes. He bore the weight of disappointment, but also a strange sense of clarity. The farm had revived, and so too had the truth of who each of his children had become. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold across the horizon, the old man and his youngest son stood together at the edge of the field. The crops swayed gently, their leaves touched by the fading light, and the air was filled with the scent of soil and growth. The old man placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm, his gaze steady. He did not speak, for words were no longer needed. In that silence lay the full weight of his decision, a promise that the land and its spirit would endure through the one who had proven worthy. The others might return again, drawn by whispers of wealth, by envy, by the desire for what they had abandoned. They might argue, demand, even fight. But the old man no longer feared their claims. The truth had been revealed in the drought, in the digging, in the discovery, and in the labor that followed. The coins had tested them, and only one had stood firm. As night settled over the farm, the lanterns glowed softly in the windows of the house, and the fields rustled like a hymn in the darkness. The old man felt weary, but it was a weariness eased by peace. He had seen the land rise again, had seen loyalty triumph over abandonment, had seen the measure of his children laid bare. Whatever trials lay ahead, the farm would endure, because it rested now not on gold, but on the unshakable bond between father and son. And as he turned to walk back toward the house, his steps slow but certain, he knew that the legacy of the land was secure. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to check out our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.